Well, good evening, everyone. As always, it's certainly a joy and a privilege to gather together this evening around God's Word. And if you have your Bibles, I'd like to invite you to turn to the book of Ruth, chapter 2, where we'll look this evening. And just by way of review, if you recall from last week, we began our look at this incredible historical account which took place during the time of the judges. So this was sometime after the death of Joshua, sometime before Saul was established as the first king of Israel. And as we learn from the first chapter of Ruth, this account is unique in that what we find here seems to be an ordinary family dealing with the same trials that anyone might face in that day. Nevertheless, they were certainly challenging times for this family where Naomi, along with her husband and her two sons, had to leave their native home in Bethlehem in Judah due to a substantial famine happening there in the land. And so they traveled to the foreign land of Moab to find relief. But while they were there, Naomi's husband Elimelech dies, leaving her and her two sons behind. And those two sons at some point marry local Moabite women by the name of Orpah and Ruth. And then after some time, both of those sons die in Moab as well. So chapter 1 sets the stage for the events of this book with a widowed and childless Naomi living in a foreign land along with her two Moabite widowed daughters-in-law. And then more importantly for the events that will unfold here, there is seemingly for Naomi no hope for descendants and no hope that her family name will carry forth. So Naomi is in as difficult of a situation as you could imagine for an older Israelite woman of that day. And as the famine finally ends and she travels back to Bethlehem, she actually appeals to her beloved daughters-in-law to go back home to Moab and to start new families so that they can avoid the same difficulties and the same bitterness that she sees for herself ahead. And after some tearful reluctancy, her first daughter-in-law, Orpah, complies with Naomi's wishes, and she heads home to Moab to start fresh. But then there's Ruth. Ruth instead clings to Naomi and refuses to depart from her. And what we found out is that Ruth has grown not only to love Naomi, but she has a genuine faith in the God of the Israelites, Yahweh, as well. So for Ruth, going back to Moab is simply not an option, given that Yahweh is with his people in Israel. And so the faithful and loyal Ruth reveals her undying devotion to Yahweh and her commitment to Naomi, and that she would rather be a suffering daughter to this widow in Israel than to be a protected wife to an idolatrous Moabite husband. So after that incredible show of faith from Ruth, these two widows head back to Bethlehem, arriving really at the best time possible to arrive during the barley harvest that will be able to meet their needs. And so that's really a review of what we saw last week in chapter 1. But keep in mind, all that we saw, that was really only the beginning where we're going to start seeing the key purposes of this incredible book revealed. And we're going to find out that God, in fact, has immense blessings in store for this family, including eventually a baby and a namesake that would actually become the grandfather of King David. But even more than that, what we find here in the book of Ruth is how God is sovereignly working in and through his people for their good and for his glory. And God is actively and closely involved in every element of the lives of his people. And the book of Ruth is really an illustration and a testimony to that fact. So with all that in mind, let's shift back to the events of the book, and we'll look to chapter 2 to find out what happens next to Naomi and Ruth now that they've arrived here in Bethlehem. And throughout Ruth chapter 2, there are really 4 interactions that are going to anchor this account of Ruth and Boaz meeting in the field. The first interaction will happen between Ruth and Naomi, which will really serve to set up the events that are the rest of the events of the chapter. You'll see that in verses 1 through 3. Then in verses 4 to 7, Boaz actually finally arrives in the field and he interacts with his employees and he begins asking about Ruth. The third interaction we'll see is sort of spread out across the day, and that happens between Ruth and Boaz as they meet for the first time, and he deals very kindly with her. You'll see that in verses 8 to 16, before finally the events conclude with Ruth and Naomi's second interaction, and they're going to talk about what happened over the course of the day in the field. That'll be verses 17 through 23. So again, really 4 interactions that anchor this account here. But before Ruth can head out for the day and before she can go to the field that we're going to hear about, first she talks with Naomi about doing so. And so let's begin by reading verses 1 through 3 of chapter 2 together. So the text says this: Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, Go, my daughter. So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. And so our story of Naomi and Ruth, it continues here in chapter 2. But before actually continuing the story, the author, who is really just this masterful part historian, part storyteller, first what they do is they provide some important background information for us in verse 1. And we learn there that Naomi actually does have a family member remaining through her now deceased husband Elimelech, a man by the name of Boaz. And this is really a bit of a surprise for us as the reader, because we're left to believe in chapter 1 that Naomi is likely all by herself without any possibility for support, other than maybe to struggle through life along with her faithful daughter-in-law Ruth, who's with her. But here the author introduces Boaz as someone who actually might be able to help them. Now, to speak briefly about Boaz, he's first described here as a kinsman, and then later in the verse he's called family of Elimelech. So both of these are going to describe a relative of sorts, but it's more like extended distant family. So it's kind of like that person who, shares the last name with you, but you only see him every 10 years at the family reunion. That's kind of what Boaz. So, and he's also called a man of great wealth. Now, more literally, that means a man of valor. So it's somebody who is of high standing or honor in society. And it means that they're distinguished both morally in the area of integrity, but also they're distinguished financially as well, which we'll learn to be true of Boaz. And once again, while this little interjection about Boaz might not seem relevant right away for us as the reader and for the original audience, what the author is doing is he's introducing information that will be critical to know later. And so the reader is thus subtly encouraged to keep this information regarding Boaz's relationship with Elimelech, to keep this information in the back of their mind as the next events unfold. So let's shift back to watching these events around Ruth and Naomi unfold here, looking now to verse 2. And here what we see is their first recorded interaction since arriving back in Bethlehem. And the conversation begins with Ruth. And Ruth is again called the Moabitess. And this is really to further highlight her position as an outsider in Israel and to point to her humility and her courage to live in this foreign country and to operate in what is really an unknown land for her. And Ruth starts the conversation by asking Naomi permission to go gather food provisions for the two of them. Notice in verse 2 as she asks, Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor. Now, as you're reading that, it seems pretty clear that Ruth is asking to carry out some sort of farming or harvesting activity. But at this point, it would probably be helpful to understand exactly what it means to glean, that word that's mentioned there. Because this is really not common activity for us. Even the word itself is very rarely used in our modern vernacular. And what gleaning means is most simply to pick up or to gather or to collect something. And in this case, it was the process of going behind the workers in the field and gathering up any of the harvest grains that they may have left behind or anything that they might have dropped during the course of their work. Now, it's important to understand that gleaning was both allowable, but more importantly, was actually commanded by God during this time as a means to provide for the poor within the nation of Israel. Specifically, Leviticus 23:22 says this, When you reap the harvest of your land, moreover, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, nor gather the gleaning of your harvest. You are to leave them for the needy and the alien. I am the Lord your God. And so even though it would mean some lost harvests and it would mean some lost profits, the landowners were required to do this, again, as God's ordained provision for the needy at the time. And it was really this perfect system because it required both the generosity of the landowner to serve others, but it also required the one who was needy to actually work for their provision, because gleaning would require hard labor to gather enough to survive. And this was a work that Ruth was willing to do, given the fact that she's requesting of Naomi to do so. Now, it's also important to note that even the fact that Ruth was having to glean during this time, it provides really a greater picture of just how destitute they were in this current situation. Ruth and Naomi were very poor, and without any job opportunities or really any other means to provide for themselves, they were really left only with the option to glean to survive. And Naomi, of course, knows of their dire position, and so she's very affirming of Ruth's request, and she gives her permission there by saying, "Go, my daughter." And so from there, as verse 3 says, Ruth, departed and went, and she goes in search of food from the fields that will enable them to survive. And it's really it's fascinating as you just stop and think for a moment about Ruth, and as you start to consider her faithfulness and her courage here in what just seems like maybe a menial task. Because if you think about it, again, you have a foreign Moabite woman, which the text continually emphasizes. She's literally brand new to the area. She's probably never gleaned before. She's probably never even heard of gleaning before, because no doubt Moab didn't have this same kind of law. And so she has no idea what kind of reception that she's going to receive when she arrives in the field. And she has no idea who will be friendly to her and who won't. But she is well aware that in order to survive, she must serve Naomi in this way. And so she goes to that field, Naomi's permission in hand, and she trusts that her God will be faithful to care for them. Even just thinking back to Ruth's faithful pronouncements back in chapter 1, verse 16, and how Naomi's people would be hers and how Naomi's God would be hers as well. Well, here you have a picture of that faith in action as she heads out and she's relying upon the kindness of God and relying upon God's people to help her to survive. Don't forget, she very easily could have followed Orpah. She could have returned back to Moab. She could have found the security of a new husband in that land that she knew well. And the labor that she heads towards now, she knew exactly the life of trials that she was signing up for. But again, she knew that it would be better to serve God and face difficulty in this life than to serve herself for ease today and yet face judgment in the life to come. So once again, Ruth continues to provide this wonderful example for us worth emulating, where we too would choose God over ease, and we too would deny ourselves, willingly following Christ, regardless of the difficulty that it might bring. Well, let's look back to verse 3, where we notice that Ruth arrives at the field and begins to glean there after the reapers. Now those reapers, these would have been the hired hands that were actually cutting the grain from the stalk. But this is not just any field, but as the verse says, she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz. And we, of course, know that she didn't just happen to come to this field, the word that's used there. There is, after all, no such thing as happenstance or blind chance, but rather what's happening here is in the eyes of those involved, it would initially seem like Ruth just coincidentally ended up here. But in reality, God's providence has brought Ruth to Boaz's field to glean. And this is, of course, the same Boaz who, as it repeats there, is of the family of Elimelech. And that description of Boaz in verse 3 is the exact same way he was described in verse 1. And that is certainly not an accidental repetition. You see, for the Israelite reader, as they're seeing that repetition, they're seeing that family relationship, at this point, their ears are definitely perking up to what they're seeing. After all, there's now an unexpected opportunity that Ruth might actually meet this relative of Elimelech, who was, of course, also related to her deceased husband as well. Why does that matter? What difference does it make? Well, if you recall from last week, we considered that concept of levirate marriage and how in Old Covenant law, if a man died, his brother, being the closest male relative in the family, was actually required to marry the wife of his deceased brother and to care for the woman and to bear children with her, and then in turn to carry forth his brother's name. And if you also recall, at Naomi's arrival back in Bethlehem, she was bitter and despondent at God's providence over her life to take her husband and her sons because she thought there was no conceivable way for that family name to carry forth. But here in chapter 2, all of a sudden, the author reveals that there actually may be extended family after all. There may be a male relative who could take on the role of the brother and who might marry the childless widow, fulfilling the levirate marriage duties. So this, for that original reader, this would have been a shocking twist at this point in the text. They would have been picking up on those regular reminders of Boaz's family connection to Elimelech and how that might be setting up the events to come. So the author here, and the way that they're writing this, is just drawing us in. They're just putting us on the edge of our seats, wondering what might come next. Will Ruth and Boaz meet? If they meet, what's going to happen next? Could this be all part of what God had planned all along? So let's keep reading to find out what happens here. And as we do, we shift now to the second interaction found within this chapter, as Boaz now comes onto the scene, speaking first with his workers there in the field. Let's read verses 4 to 7 together. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "May the Lord be with you." And they said to him, "May the Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" The servants in charge of the reapers replied, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. And so Boaz arrives at his field from Bethlehem, presumably checking on the progress of the day's harvest, and acknowledges his workers with what is likely a customary yet encouraging greeting as he says to them, "May the Lord be with you." But then Boaz notices something, or really better said, he notices someone who he clearly has not seen at his fields before, and who has clearly drawn his interest as well. So much so, in fact, that he asked the man in charge, "Whose young woman is this?" Now the question itself, it's a little unique in form, as Boaz is essentially asking who Ruth belongs to, which within this culture, it very well could have been alluding to male headship, where he was asking about, who her father was or who her husband was, or it could just simply be that he's never seen her before, and so he's inquiring about who maybe she works for. But either way, she has his attention very clearly at this point. And in verse 6, the worker answers the question by explaining to Boaz that this is Ruth, the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. Now, if you remember from the end of chapter 1, in verse 19, when Naomi and Ruth arrived back in Bethlehem, the entire town was stirred up in a joyous celebration over the return of Naomi and her new companion. And given that fanfare, it would almost be a certainty that everyone in town had heard the story of Naomi and how they had heard of Ruth, the loyal daughter-in-law who came back with her. So Boaz would have certainly been well aware of who Ruth was, and verse 11 later on is going to confirm that. But clearly, at this point, he's never actually seen her before. So what the worker does then is he's making the connection for Boaz. But Boaz's worker doesn't just stop there at simply answering his question about who Ruth is, but he continues on in verse 7 to explain exactly what she's doing here in Boaz's field. And he reveals that Ruth actually asked permission to glean here on Boaz's field and to gather sheaves or piles of provision to take home. So just like she requested Naomi to allow her to go glean in the first place, here we learn that she also asked to glean on this field in particular. And certainly that was a surprising thing to ask, given that the law would allow her to glean even without permission. which is probably why the worker here is so quick to volunteer this information to Boaz without even being asked. They've probably never been asked a question like this before. Again, all of this for Ruth, all of this is highlighting her humility as she's operating within this new land. But not only is Ruth humble here in verse 7, but she's also very clearly a hard worker, because the rest of verse 7 says that she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. So Boaz's employee explains that Ruth has been working from morning until now, and in terms of time frame, now is very likely going to be later in the morning or potentially midday. And that worker is highlighting the hardworking nature by the fact that she's only been sitting for a little while in that house. And that house is probably just a shelter of sorts. It's probably set up in the field to provide some form of shade and maybe a place to take a break. So once again, the point being that with only a little bit of a break, Ruth has been diligently laboring all morning in the late spring sun to gather anything she can for her and Naomi to survive. Ruth is what we today might call a hardworking Proverbs 31 woman, as they say. She girds herself with strength and makes her arms strong, Proverbs 31:17 says. And she is not afraid of the labor to faithfully serve Naomi and to meet their mutual needs. I dare say that there's not too many people in general in our day who would work so diligently as we're seeing here without complaint, as Ruth has. And so she continues to prove herself a faithful follower of Yahweh, and a faithfulness that all the town at this point seems to have heard of, and which Boaz will confirm later on. But for now, from his interaction with his workers, Boaz now knows who Ruth is, and he's heard all that she's done thus far, not only for Naomi and not only for God, but also even just today as a humble, hard worker within his field. And so at this point, Boaz decides to act on all he's heard, and he just has to go meet Ruth for the first time. And so let's read about their interactions together in verses 8 through 16 before we walk through it. The text says this, starting in verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Boaz replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother in the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here, that you may eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left. When she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servants, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. Also you shall purposely pull out for her some grain from the bundles, and leave it so that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." Well, if you remember back in verse 2, Ruth said that she hoped to glean in the field of one she would find favor with. Well, it would seem that is exactly what has happened here with Boaz, and what favor she has found here. We'll detail some of this, but within their interactions across these verses, you can see his generosity is just steadily increasing across this passage. First, in verses 8 and 9, he offers her to glean exclusively in his field and allowing her to gather alongside his maids or his employees rather than behind them, as the other gleaners would have to. Then he offers her protection. Then he offers her water that's meant for his workers, both in verse 9 as well. Then later on in verse 14, he serves a meal to her, one so bountiful that there are even leftovers. And then finally in verse 16, he actually tells his people to purposefully leave behind some of the good pickings to make sure that she has plenty to gather. So his kindness and his generosity towards Ruth is just continuing to compound as this day goes on. And as we'll see throughout, Ruth could not be more grateful for it. But once again, this all begins there in verse 8, where we find the very first meeting between Boaz and Ruth. And he starts by capturing her attention and saying to her, "Listen carefully, my daughter." Now, by addressing her as my daughter, his gentle and affectionate approach doesn't mean that he views her as a familial daughter, the way that one might address their own child, but rather this was a very common yet generous greeting that would be used towards a much younger woman. And so this greeting actually reveals that there's a clear age gap between Ruth and Boaz, and chapter 3 will later affirm that as well. And then after that greeting, Boaz begins to explain his desire to serve Ruth in her labors. And he first tells her, "Do not go glean in another field." Now, translators have said that this is actually an emphatic prohibition in the original Hebrew. So it would carry the force of something along the lines of don't even think about going to another field. And to a poor person who relies on the practice of gleaning to survive, that would be a very strange request. Because if you think about the process of going behind the gatherers to pick up what they've dropped, well, once they're done gathering, there'd be no more opportunity to pick up anything else. So you would almost have to move on to the next field and then follow the workers there, hoping to gather enough across multiple fields to be able to survive. So by itself, Boaz telling Ruth to glean only in his field, it would be a very strange request. But he continues on to explain that it would actually be worth her while to stay in his fields. Because as the end of verse 8 says, Ruth would actually be allowed to gather with his maids. So these were employees of his. And the way that the employees would operate during harvest time is that the reapers, previously mentioned, those were typically men, they would cut the grain and they would create piles as they went along. And then coming behind them would be the maids. And those maids, they would collect the piles and they would tie them up into bundles. And those bundles could then later be brought to the threshing floor where the grain could be separated from the chaff. So it was the process was basically this all hands on deck. It was a team effort, including both men and women, to ensure that the harvest could be accomplished in time. This was only a short window. And anything that was dropped or missed during that process was, of course, available to those who were gleaning. But what Boaz was offering for Ruth is that she could actually join his employees who were tying up the bundles. And instead of walking behind them, she could walk along with them and gather for herself as they went along. So this would have been an immense privilege for any lowly and poor person that he's offering here, and it would almost guarantee that she would be able to pick up enough grain to be able to survive. But this privilege was also completely unheard of at the time. And you see what happens here is if Boaz's employees would have seen a poor person like Ruth gleaning alongside the maids, they would have almost certainly actually tried to stop her, and they would have yelled at her to get out of the field. They might have even physically removed her from the field because they would have looked at her and they would have seen her as gleaning illegally, and they would have viewed her as someone who is actually stealing grain and therefore stealing profit from their employer, Boaz. And so that's exactly why in the middle of verse 9, Boaz also guarantees Ruth's protection in the process. And he says to Ruth, "Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you." So Boaz was making sure that his people knew of Ruth's special privilege and that they wouldn't harm her or treat her roughly as she walked along with the maids after the reapers. So already in this conversation, short thus far, but already Boaz has promised her provision and he's promised her protection as well. And then, continuing on in verse 9, he even promises her water too. And he tells her to drink from that which has already been gathered by his workers. After all, gleaning was hard work, and Ruth would need to drink. But if she had to gather water for herself, then she would have been wasting precious time that could be spent gleaning. So Boaz tells her not to worry about that either, and to drink from the jars that were already prepared. And so it's safe to say at this point that this generosity from Boaz goes well above and beyond the favor that Ruth even had hoped she might find this day in the fields. And she is just simply overwhelmed by his kindness. And she responds to him in verse 10 by falling to her face and bowing before him. And this would have been a response of great humility and great gratitude in that day. In fact, she's so surprised by it all that she just has to ask him why. How is it that Boaz has singled her out for such generosity here? And in verses 11 and 12, Boaz goes on to answer that question by essentially summarizing everything that we saw last week in chapter 1, and by explaining that he is only, in his eyes, merely rewarding her faithfulness to God and rewarding her kindness to Naomi with the same sort of kindness that she's shown. And so as verse 11 begins with, Boaz reveals that it has been fully reported or told to him all that Ruth has done for Naomi, even after her own husband died. And not only has Boaz heard of Ruth's kindness towards Naomi, but he's also well aware of her leaving her parents in her native Moab, as the rest of verse 11 explains, all to live with Naomi's people, a people that Ruth did not previously know. So Boaz has been told of her willingness to turn from the comfort and safety of all that she'd known previously to instead come to Israel and to be with God and his people. And it would seem from Boaz's explanation that Ruth has really grown quite the reputation already in her short time here in Bethlehem. And despite her being from Moab, it was an extremely positive reputation amongst God's people, who were very clearly, by Boaz's example, very clearly impressed and even amazed at her faithfulness shown here by this widowed Moabite. And for Boaz, in his mind, there's no amount of generosity that he could show to Ruth that would even compare to what he has seen from Ruth and what he believes she deserves for her acts of faith. He's just seeing his generosity as merely rewarding her for what her faithfulness has earned, which is exactly what he articulates there in verse 12. He says there, "May the Lord reward your work. May your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel." Both are really expressions of desired blessing for Ruth. Boaz's desire is for Ruth to receive in turn from the Lord that which in Boaz's eyes she has earned through her faithfulness. Boaz has observed how she sought refuge and protection under the wings of the Lord, as he says, and he trusts that the Lord will care for her accordingly. And this is really fascinating to me because if you're looking at the language here in verse 12 from Boaz, you may remember this, but it's very similar to the same kind of desire that Naomi actually expressed for her daughters-in-law back in chapter 1. And in the back half of verse 8 there, if you recall, she said to those young women, "May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." Very similar language. But what's amazing to consider here is that it would seem that God has indeed begun to answer that prayer here and now through Boaz. So in Boaz desiring the same thing for Ruth that Naomi desired, he is unknowingly part of answering the very prayer that he is also praying here as well. It's just a fascinating connection within the book. And just as we consider this, consider how not only is this an example here of God's promise to answer those who pray according to his will, but even more than that, what another incredible reminder of God's sovereignty, perfectly working in the lives of his people for their good and for his glory. The author here continues to masterfully draw together this theme which runs all throughout the book of Ruth, and to show how God is never limited by the short-sightedness of created man, and how his plans are wisest and best, even when we can't necessarily see that. And Boaz's desired blessings for and his generosity towards Ruth is just another unexpected example of that truth in action here in the book of Ruth. Well, now that Boaz has answered Ruth's question as to why he's being so kind to her in verses 11 to 12, her response in verse 13 just continues or shows her continued surprise and humility with his generosity. as she respectfully and humbly addresses Boaz as my lord. And she tells him how the favor she has found in his sight has comforted her, and how with his encouragement of her faithfulness, he has spoken kindly to her, even though her status would be the lowliest in society, below even his maidservants. So Ruth knew the humble position in life that she had signed up for when she followed Naomi back to Bethlehem. And to receive this kindness from Boaz, it really seems to have shocked her. And it seems to have caused just immense gratitude in her as well, which she's expressing to him there in verse 13. But the kindness from Boaz is not done yet, is it? And with verses 14 through 16, there's additional generosity, but there's also a bit of a shift in scene as well, because the author next references mealtime. So what we have here is a break in the work of the day. This is probably around midday, given the fact that Ruth is actually, after this meal, going to go back to glean more. And during this meal, Boaz invites her to come here and to enjoy a meal of bread dipped in vinegar, as well as some roasted grain, which would be mentioned later in verse 14. And all of the food that's mentioned here, this would have been a common meal of that day. And the vinegar was likely consisting of sour wine mixed with a little bit of oil. So that was intended to be a thirst quencher for the hardworking laborers. And the roasted grains, those were probably pulled directly from the harvest, then roasted over fire and ready to eat nice and warm. So this would have been perfect sustenance to strengthen the workers for the rest of the day. But Ruth, the lowly foreign widow, is invited to sit even amongst Boaz's employees to enjoy this wonderful meal. This would have been a place of acceptance, and even in a sense, for her, this would have been a place of honor. So it would have been plain to see by everybody present there that Boaz was very clearly showing favor to this young woman, and even maybe a special interest to this faithful Moabite as well. In fact, the text even says that Boaz served Ruth himself. It's certainly strange behavior for a landowner to serve anyone, let alone a gleaner on his field who wasn't paid and who wasn't contributing anything to his profits. In fact, was actually taking away from his profits. And yet he serves her. And during that meal, the end of verse 14 describes how Ruth had so much to eat that she was fully satisfied. And she had even been served enough by Boaz that she had leftovers as well. So certainly, if you think back to the start of her day, this would have been a very far cry from that famine-stricken difficulty that she left the house with that morning. And so with her belly now full, in verse 15, Ruth gets up and she goes back to work. And as she's leaving, Boaz ensures that there's no confusion among his servants, that Ruth is under his protection, and that she ought to be left alone without insult, really talking about without verbal abuse or without any kind of embarrassment as she goes about her gathering. But then, in verse 16, he adds even one more blessing to Ruth's efforts by even instructing his employees to actually pull out and set aside some of the grain from the reaper's piles so that she can glean from that as well. Essentially what's happening here is Boaz is guaranteeing that Ruth will have plenty of grains to take home so that she would never have to glean elsewhere in another field, as he proposed to her back in verse 8. Once again, all of this is just generosity compounding upon generosity. This is favor upon favor and kindness upon kindness shown by Boaz. And as he made clear earlier, the reason for all of this kindness is because of what Ruth has already shown to Naomi and to God. Boaz seeks to honor God by serving his people and by meeting the needs of the widowed Ruth and Naomi through these acts of kindness that we've seen thus far. Well, at this point in the text, as we get to verse 17, the narrator here in that verse really provides a transition in the passage by first wrapping up Ruth's day in the field and then by describing how much she was able to glean over the course of that day. And so verse 17 says, "So she gleaned in the field until evening, then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley." So Ruth was there in the field all day, even until evening. And again, this is really further highlighting and revealing her work ethic. And at the end of the day, it says that she beat out what she had gleaned, And this is really the process of using a stick to separate the kernels of grain from the husk, or separating the grain from the chaff. That way, the load would have been lighter, and it would have been easier to carry home. You just would have been left with the edible good stuff, the cookable stuff, after that process. But even in doing that process, it turns out that Ruth still had quite the load to carry, because an ephah of barley is estimated by historians to be 29 pounds of grains. Just to put that into perspective, one commentator said that the normal worker would have to spend half a month's wages to purchase that much grain for themselves. And Ruth collected that in one day. The point in alluding to this detail is that Ruth just gathered a ton of food. This would have been way more than any one person would have been able to glean in that day. Usually someone gleaning is barely getting enough to survive to the next day, where they would just have to go through the process again. So this amount that she has here is a testimony both to Ruth's hard work, but even more so to just how generous Boaz had been with her, with the special privileges he provided in his field. And so at this point in the story, Ruth piles up her haul and she heads back to the city of Bethlehem, where we read next about the fourth and final interaction in this chapter, as Ruth will now return home to Naomi, and she's going to tell her beloved mother-in-law about her wonderful day in the field. So let's read verses 18 through 23 together. It says, "She, Ruth, took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also took it out and gave Naomi what she had left after she was satisfied. Her mother-in-law then said to her, 'Where did you glean today, and where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed.' So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, 'The name of the man with whom I worked today is Boaz.' Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, 'May he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead.' Again, Naomi said to her, 'The man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives.' Then Ruth the Moabitess said, 'Furthermore, he said to me, you should stay close to my servants until they have finished all my harvest.' Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his maids, so that others do not fall upon you in another field.' So she stayed close by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law." Now, before we look at that conversation between Ruth and Naomi, notice one thing at the end of verse 18. Because not only did Ruth bring Naomi everything that she had gleaned, but the text also says that she gave Naomi what she had left after she was satisfied. Now, you might recall that word satisfied from the midday meal in verse 14, where Boaz had served Ruth so much that she had leftovers. Well, what we learn here is that Ruth has actually been saving those leftovers all day long for Naomi. That means she's been somehow carrying them around all afternoon, just so that when she gets home, she can serve her mother-in-law the extras from her delicious lunch. I mean, just talk about a level of thoughtfulness and care for this woman that she loves. Not only laboring all day to glean for her, but to bring her a meal as well. So again, just Ruth continues to exhibit a selflessness and a character that we would all do well to emulate. But it's funny because Naomi actually seems to not even see the meal right away, because when she notices how much grain that Ruth has brought home, she's just completely amazed and shocked by the amount. And what she says to Ruth in verse 19 reveals her excitement. She's rapidly asking her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work?" And then before even allowing her to answer, she blurts out this blessing for whoever it was that clearly showed an extra generosity to her. And then Ruth, who you just have to imagine Ruth at this point is just utterly exhausted, yet she's still rejoicing with her mother-in-law. Ruth answers Naomi by revealing that the man who showed her favor was Boaz. Now, upon learning this, in verse 20, Naomi blesses the man again. But there's something markedly different in her statement that I want you to notice. You see, in verse 19, there was a very generic statement of blessing to whoever the man was. But in verse 20, now that she knows it's Boaz, Naomi states very specifically for Boaz to be blessed of the Lord. So the same Naomi who was bitter for her circumstances and blamed the Lord for afflicting her and causing her bitterness is now desiring for God to bless Boaz. She's showing signs of appreciation to God for Boaz, and really she's showing signs of appreciation to God in general. So why the change? Why has Naomi, at least seemingly, changed her tune from chapter 1 just with this news about Boaz favoring Ruth? Well, the answer seems to come from two pieces of evidence in the text. First, she mentions how God ought to bless Boaz because of his kindness shown to both the living, which would certainly allude to Ruth and Naomi, but also kindness shown to the dead as well. And so that would mean in Naomi's eyes, Boaz has somehow been kind to her husband and their two sons. That's who Naomi is referencing here when she mentions the dead. But how is it exactly that Boaz has been kind to these men? Well, the second piece of evidence behind Naomi's changing perspective answers that question as well. And this comes later in verse 20 when Naomi explains to Ruth who Boaz is. She tells her, this man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives. So that means that Naomi must have known of Boaz, but for reasons unknown to us, she never considered him as a potential provider for them. Until now, that is. And what verse 20 is showing us is that Naomi seems to be putting the pieces together, where God might actually be providing that which she previously thought impossible. This brings us back full circle to the beginning of this chapter, where the narrator sets up the events by pointing to Boaz as being a relative to Elimelech. And in Naomi's mind, when she learns of Boaz's kindness towards Ruth, the light seems to go on that God might be working something out here. And at the very least, he might be providing the safety and provision that was lost when her husband and sons died. But based on the events that we'll see in chapter 3 later on, it would seem that Naomi was beginning to see a way for that family name to potentially go forth as well. Even that word that she uses for closest relative, depending on your translation, might be translated as redeemer. And that word is often used to describe a man who would take on many of the responsibilities to care for the household of their deceased relative, one of which includes the levirate marriage responsibilities. So even textually, the fact that Naomi describes Boaz in this way would allude to her starting to consider the possibility for a potential future marriage. So all this excitement from Naomi, it would actually seem that she's excited about much more than just the huge amount of grain that Ruth has returned with. And at the end of chapter 2, we see a demeanor from her, from Naomi, that is a complete 180 from where she was at the end of chapter 1. Now Ruth, for her part, on the surface, she seems to have really no idea, at least initially, what has Naomi so excited. Because in verse 21, she seems more focused on the gleaning again, as she continues to describe the kindness of Boaz during the day and his offer to remain in his field until the end of harvest. And so Naomi then, perhaps seeing that Ruth hasn't quite caught on yet, she sweetly addresses her as my daughter in verse 22. And she tenderly affirms the goodness of Ruth remaining in Boaz's field, both so she can be protected from danger, but also seemingly very likely so she can remain near Boaz and remain within his care. And after that, and what at this point is no surprise at all from Ruth, Ruth faithfully follows the guidance of Naomi. And as verse 23 confirms, she gleaned alongside Boaz's maids through both barley and wheat harvest season. And combined, those two seasons would have lasted about 7 weeks or so, running from late April until early June. And so she stays in Boaz's field, working there, and then throughout that time, she lived with Naomi, continuing to provide for and to care for her beloved mother-in-law. So while most of the events in chapter 2, it really all happened over the course of one day, what that last verse serves to do is going to jump the account forward several weeks, which chapter 3 will then pick up again as well. So one of those transition verses. And so as these events within the book of Ruth have continued to unfold, we've seen even more so how the character and how the faithfulness of Ruth has begun to really flourish here in chapter 2. And she's diligently labored to meet her needs and to meet Naomi's needs. And she's done all of it with great humility, with great gratitude, and with great selflessness as well. And now here in chapter 2, we finally met Boaz, who has very clearly proven to be a very generous man. And he has been more than willing to go above and beyond to reward the faithfulness of others who also love his God. And even with Naomi, there's some complex and interesting things happening here as she seems to be maybe showing signs of potentially moving away from her bitterness. So it's going to be fascinating to continue to see what happens next with each person within this historical account. But above all else within chapter 2, we see even more so God's perfect and sovereign plan for this family beginning to unfold here. And we're gaining greater clarity on the magnificent way that God is working together all things for the good of his people. And as we look at this, certainly the takeaway isn't that we should be, constantly searching for these little signs of what our circumstances might look like next in our lives. But at the very least, we ought to at least acknowledge that God's wisdom and God's sovereignty infinitely exceeds anything that a mere man could think of. Amen? So let us rejoice in what we're seeing here. Let us be humbled by God's sovereignty and the way he's perfectly working out the plan in this family. And let us, in light of this, bring him the praise and honor that he's due because of this. And Lord willing, I look forward to seeing God's perfect plan unfold even more next week in chapter 3. But for now, let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we're so grateful for this truth, so grateful for this wonderful historic account of the way you worked through this family and the way you ordained trials here. And as we're starting to see here now with this chapter, the way you had a wonderful plan in place all along, a plan that no mere man could have ever fathomed. Lord, we ought to be humbled by these things. Even reading an account like this, as we see these events unfold, we ought to just realize just how utterly other you are in all things than us. You as the creator, us as the created, and how separate and holy you are. What a wonderful reminder in this account. Let us be humbled by that, and let us realize too just how separate we are from you, and even especially in our sin, seeing how our sin has separated us from you and how we need redemption through Christ. So let us just remember those things, reflect on those things, meditate on those things in light of what we see here. And Lord willing, we look forward to seeing these things unfold even more as we read about this account in the next couple weeks. But we're thankful, Lord, for this time. We're thankful for your word. And we're thankful, Lord, for you using your word to convict us and bring about humility, as I pray would be the case for all of us.